guess when Optum first referred back to HSD for possible issues, and I think we heard testimony that the HSD in consultation with the Attorney General's office decided to get a secretary on. Is that not correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, that's not correct. It's to the best of my knowledge. Jody, Mr. Kern actually works sort of on a daily basis with HSD because we do have some information back and forth.
The Medicaid Fraud Control Unit meets regularly with representatives from the Human Services Department. They inform us as much as possible of their procedures, what they expect to do. So they made us aware of the Optum audit and their intent to hire ECG at an early date. However, the idea that it was in consultation with us is not correct. They merely inform us about what they intend to do. They don't elicit any direction from us or instructions on how to do that. And so I think that portion of the audit or that sentence is a little misleading. That's not quite how it is.
Mr. Chairman, let me also ask, the allegations of credible fraud, allegations of fraud, that's purely the HSD's call?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, that's the part that their agency does. I think that a misconception that has partly been fostered by the Human Services Department when they said that we somehow or another approve those credible allegations of fraud. We don't approve or disapprove. What happens is once they make the finding of a credible allegation of fraud and they refer it to my Medicaid fraud unit, then we have to do an investigation as to whether or not there is fraud. And so that's our job. And once we get the referral, we pretty much are in a position where we have to do an investigation and we have to decide whether it's fraud or not. But when we're done, and I know it's going to take a little bit of time, but when we're done, there won't be speculation about whether there's fraud or not. There will be cases where we find that we have sufficient evidence to go in front of a jury that there is fraud, or we will have cases where we look at all the evidence and we say there's not sufficient evidence to go before a jury. So no more credible allegations of fraud by the time we're done with it. That our job is to actually do the investigation.
That's it. Mr. Chairman, in general, if you get a whistleblower, say, call your office and say, this company is charging my account, but you don't ever work on it. Would that be something that you would make the determination of?
Mr. Chairman,
refer back to HSD.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Tripp, there, actually, and maybe Joey can talk about the actual process here because that's one where I may not know. We certainly have whistleblowers that we call and have called our agency, our Medicaid fraud unit directly. Now, whether or not they can do that without a referral or whether they have to send that back to the agency, I don't know. Do you send those back to the agency or we do independent investigation based on tips that we get?
Representative, Mr. Chairman, we would do an independent investigation. If we get a whistleblower tip, we act on that whistleblower tip independent of what HSD is doing with that tip. Typically, a whistleblower will contact us and HSD and the local police department and the FBI. So typically, a whistleblower complaint will go to a lot of different agencies. But if we get it, we will act on it independently most times.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can also ask on this credible allegation. So that could be a credible allegation of criminal fraud or civil fraud, either one?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tripp, that's correct.
So it still falls to your agency or human services.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tripp, that's also correct.
I'm just curious how that works. And Mr. Chairman, I've got a lot of input from some of my providers, saying they don't have input into the system. So do you go and interview them on the issues? Are they notified of what the issues are against them?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tripp, at the appropriate point in the investigation, we would have investigators on the ground that will go to the agency and interview the billing clerks, potentially the owner of the agency, potentially other people that work for the agency. It might be that we would have already interviewed a whistleblower. Whistleblowers don't often, but sometimes they do, report to their employers, that there's a problem that might come directly to us. So yes, we would certainly, before we brought any case charging criminal fraud, say to a grand jury, to a magistrate judge or whatever, I think that there would be an opportunity there for the person who's charged to know that they've been charged, or to know what the general parameters of the crimes that they're being accused of.
And then, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask, as far as the, being notified of the issues when they file for an exemption, I guess, with HSD, are they notified in writing somehow exactly what was found against them? Do they have privy to what's in the audit against them specifically?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tripp, actually, there's a case where I don't believe that the provider agencies know certainly all of the specific allegations against them at the point when they're filing their request for a good cause. And the good cause is not often, I don't think that the system is designed to let people argue about whether any particular allegation is a good allegation or not. I think that Senator O'Neill, when he was reading from this, talked about one of the big issues for good cause, which would be just to say that the way that this is impacting us in our community, there are people out there that need services that aren't getting services. So my understanding, a lot of the good cause requests that were made by the providers were solely to point out that their clients, who they're very concerned about, were essentially falling through the cracks and weren't getting services.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, President. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not a regular member of this committee, but I happened to be at the July hearings for LFC when this was discussed, and the Attorney General responded to some of my questions there. Also, I was present at the LFC meetings in Chama when the state auditor presented a report relative to what the role of the state auditor was in this process. And I happened to sit in on the Health and Human Services Committee meetings in Lee County recently where this issue was discussed, and one of the new oversight providers out of Arizona was present and was very forthcoming with regard to testimony. There was a great deal of frustration, I think, at a number of meetings why Optum, wasn't at the table to explain their role in this process. And I guess my observation based on testimony was that once allegations are made, whether credible or not, the determination is made by HSD, I guess in this case, that there may be the potential for fraud. In the state of New Mexico, then the investigative arm is the Attorney General's office. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, is that not correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bratton, yes, the way that the federal law is set up is that the provider agency cannot be the same agency as the agency that investigates fraud, and so they're divided. In every state, they're divided. In most states, the Medicaid fraud unit falls under the Attorney General's office, although not all.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, I think at the July hearing, I specifically asked you if the allegations, what appears to be an allegation of fraud, if that determination is made by the referring agency to your office, then there are, once that referral gets to your office, then there are certain federal requirements that have to be met with regard to suspension of payments and so forth. Is that not correct?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I'll let Jody, the one that works with that right now.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. Once they decide to, once they determine a credible allegation of fraud, they must suspend payment, and then they must refer it to our office. So that's the
the sequence under federal
yes,
federal guidelines.
Yeah, Code of Federal Regulations 455.23 and 6.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not a regular reader of the Albuquerque Journal, maybe I should be, but I also understand that a number of providers ran to federal court trying to get an injunction to continue payments. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, do you know if that's correct or not?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bratton, I don't know if it was brought in federal court, but I know that a number of the providers filed a motion for an injunction. Yeah, that was the federal practice.
And was that approved?
No, my understanding is that the federal court, did not grant the temporary restraining order or permanent injunction.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, you know, there's been questioning with regard to the process of selecting PCG, Public Consulting Group, to come in and take a look once Optum determined that there might be some irregularities. You know, I've sat through at least 8 exit audits, and I know with regard to interaction with the auditors that no audit firm comes in and looks at every item over the past year that the particular agency has processed. They do spot checks. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Balderas, is that not correct on the audit procedure, that it's basically that you go in and you do a spot check or a sampling to make sure that everything has been done according to the requirements, and then if you find an area where there appears to be an irregularity, you may dig deeper into that. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Balderas, it's my understanding from testimony that was presented at the LFC hearings in Chama that part of your role in this process is to make sure that there is a process in place that guarantees that we properly account for federal dollars that flow through the state of New Mexico in the way of Medicaid funds, and that we properly account for how those are handled by the state of New Mexico, and that there are procedures in place that guarantee under the federal requirements that we've done that. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And then we're also, and I just want to clarify, I think there was a comparison to the PCG report sampling as opposed to what we do. And what has been confirmed that is different is that there's been an extrapolation and a statistical extrapolation up when referring to fraud. And we do not do that when we determine a fraudulent amount. I just want to be correct on when we assess risk, we do an actual dollar amount and confirm that it is indeed a high risk level for fraud, and there may be an issue with this type of statistical modeling of PCPU, but I can't publicly conclude that till I release my report, but that is an area that we're testing that you can feel is compared to the differences.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, I think, you know, as I understand it, when you subpoenaed the PCG audit from the Attorney General's office, that primarily you wanted to make sure that there was a process in place and that HSD was going through the procedures to make sure that the mechanism for tracking the expenditure of federal dollars that flow through the state of New Mexico were properly accounted for under federal law. Is that correct?
Chairman Representative, we actually, for correction, for the record, we subpoenaed the Health and Human Services Department, not the Attorney General. And part of it is for the financial audit, and then also part of it is to specifically verify how it is that agency determined credible allegation of fraud before they referred it to the Attorney General. In other words, to measure and verify all of the evidence, information according to the regulation that they relied upon, because it's been very, it's not very clear at this point, Representative.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, just for clarity, relative to the selection of the public consulting group, I know when I was on the city council in Hobbs, if there were approved vendors on the state vendor list, then, you know, the city could make an acquisition of, say, a motor vehicle from an approved vendor that the state had approved. And do we have a similar mechanism where if there are groups that are approved by the federal government, that those we have authority to select from their list of approved vendors and select those for use by the state of New Mexico as it deals with the expenditure of federal dollars.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, Evan Blackson, Chief of Staff from the State Auditor's Office. It's understanding, after looking at this process, PCG actually appeared on a federal price agreement list, and the state used the provision of the procurement code that applies to the use of price agreements to select PCG in that manner. So I think that's accurate.
Okay, well, I just wanted some clarification on that. I trying to piece all this together, and as I look at, the whole chain reaction appeared to have begun as a result of information that came to light by Optum. And yet Optum has not appeared before any of the LFC hearings that I've been a part of, nor, I think there was a level of frustration on the part of members of the House and the Senate to participate in Health and Human Services hearings, at least the ones in Lee County that I sat in on. But now that, there have been allegations made, I question whether or not if you brought them to the table, how much information could be forthcoming as a result of the fact that there's an investigation that's ongoing. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, I think there is that level of frustration with regard to due process, and I think there were questions with regard to how you handle the information once a determination has been made of potential allegations of either criminal or civil misconduct that could impact, the recovery of federal dollars that pass through the state, and our responsibility as accountants for that to the federal government. And I think, Mr. Chairman, if I remember correctly, in the July hearings in Albuquerque, Mr. Attorney General, I asked you specifically, once allegations are made, can you sit down at the table with one of those providers and have an exit interview?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bratton, I actually don't remember that specific question, but I'm happy to answer it now to the best of my knowledge. I think that as we're doing an investigation, that at any point that we deem it's important or useful in the investigation, that we could sit down with the entity that's been charged and have discussions with them, interview them, do those various kinds of things. I think this is a matter of general criminal law, that once they become, a target, or once we have probable cause, then, we certainly wouldn't be able to interview them without certain protections that would be available to them, the right to have a lawyer, all those kinds of things that we're aware of. So I don't know exactly what your question is about with regard to having like exit interviews or whatever, but once we have it, we would certainly have, and will have interaction with each one of the providers, but the kind of interaction that we have with them will depend on where the evidence leads.
Well, Mr. Chairman, and I probably phrased the question a little differently at the hearings in Albuquerque, but I think the gist was that if there's suspicion, and there's a whole different mechanism with regard to how you proceed, and it's not at that point what I would call a typical exit interview, as you close out an audit to discuss audit findings and so forth, because the potential that if there is wrongdoing, I think documents might be destroyed and so forth before it could be carried that next step for criminal investigation. But I sense a level of frustration on the part of legislative members with regard to how we got to this point, what the role of Optum was in the process. And because if there are situations that could have been addressed in a different manner because of the process that we went through, and it was maybe handled in such a way that billing was misunderstood, the process of how you documented, delivery of services and so forth. Could those have been resolved at a lower level before we got to a point of suspension of payment, change of oversight, and so forth? And, I'm curious, Mr. Chairman, and this probably isn't a question for either one of the gentlemen here, but I'm curious about the contract with the state of New Mexico from Optum's standpoint. I see them as basically an accountant. All these providers flow documents through them, and they handle the paperwork to make sure that there's proper coding, proper documentation, so that they can attest to the state of New Mexico, this is a credible bill, and the bill needs to be paid. They're a paper hand. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if either one of the Attorney General or the State Auditor want to respond to that, but that's kind of the role that I envision that they have. And I know under federal guidelines, you're dealing with a constantly moving target, because the regulations are constantly changing with regard to what's required and so forth. And we have to make sure that we're always in compliance. And I know technology has changed by leaps and bounds with regard to the electronic age that we have. We know the problems we had with share, and in some cases are still having. And I wonder how much of this is not because all of a sudden a new version of software became available, and all of a sudden we start seeing red flags pop up. And in some cases, I think from at least what I've gleaned from the 3 hearings I've sat in on, is there were enough red flags came up and enough conflicting information that somebody made a determination that there was the potential. And once that determination was made, then certain steps have to be followed to safeguard the taxpayer dollars, whether federal or state. And I think I've asked more than once that if we continue to make payments once we've identified the potential for fraud, and it turns out that there was fraud, then the federal government can come back to the state of New Mexico and say, you identified that potential, you didn't cease and desist in payments, therefore you are now liable to refund those dollars that were expended to the federal government and become state tax dollars that are at risk. And I think that's one of the major reasons that we're all concerned as legislators, because we have a responsibility in our agreement to accept those dollars from the federal government and be accountable for those dollars, that if we did not suspend payment and there was suspicion that we could potentially be liable. Now, could this have been altered some way in past years by virtue of the fact that we had better checks and balances in place so that this information came to light quicker, and you had the opportunity when it first came to light to sit down like you typically do in an exit interview for an audit and say, these are our findings, what's your explanation? But I think we got to a point where we didn't have that option anymore. the suspicion was at a level that it had to be turned over to the investigative arm for the state of New Mexico. And as such, certain federal guidelines kicked in. And, you know, where it's gonna lead, you know, I understand exactly the comments made by the Attorney General, Mr. Chairman, that, you know, they can't spot check. They've got to go through and look at all of it now. Or at least look at it to a sufficient level that they can build a case and or be assured that they've looked at it extensively enough that there's nothing there before they draw a conclusion and make a recommendation or proceed with the prosecution. But I think the question is, you know, was due process denied? And I think because of the mechanism that we went through to get there, you know, as I read through this and as I've heard testimony, first thing that happened, often, you know, started seeing a lot of red flags. And I think from testimony that was delivered is some of those red flags were created because of new software that came into the system that allowed us to do more things electronically with regard to comparing what's going on. And that was at a sufficient level that an outside group was brought in to do a spot audit. And the spot audit information tended to confirm a lot of the red flags to the point that there was at least suspicion to move that forward to the Attorney General for investigation. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, I see you nodding your head. Is that kind of the way it played out?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bratton, that strikes me as the longest question I've ever heard from a legislator. So I'll try and give you a concise answer. So I'm not being mean, Representative. I mean, you cover a lot of ground there. There are two or three things that I think that you're saying there. One is, I do recall, and I think probably my answer to the question then was that there were indeed things that could have been done, but what might not be clear to everybody is by the Human Services Department before they make their finding of credible allegations of fraud, that they had some discretion there, that, you know, to go talk with the agencies, to go, you know, to look deeper into the Optum thing, to, you know, whatever the Optum report was, to look at the PCG audit and say, okay, well, this is really good information, but now we need to do more investigation on our own. They have a number of options. I think that the options get a lot smaller once they make the allegation of credible allegations of fraud to us, because that triggers, as you said, all of these federal guidelines that come into play. I also think that it really made sense to me what you said about it's our job, the auditor's job, and mine and the agencies to protect our federal dollars, and I think that if we fall down on the job, that the federal government might very well ask us to repay certain monies. One of the things that I think is really interesting here that might not have ever occurred before, and it goes back to what the auditor said, is that normally, if we wanted to go to the federal government and tell them that we had discovered $30 million in fraud, you would want to do that based on actual findings of $30 million worth of fraud. And what's different in this case is in the PCG audit that they sampled about, my understanding, like 150 billings, and then based on their findings of those billings, they extrapolated up to, okay, if there's this much Medicaid dollars being spent in New Mexico, then our statistical analysis tells us that there must be this much fraud. And I don't know that we should necessarily be getting the federal government all spun up over how much fraud there is in New Mexico based on that statistical analysis. And I think that was really the gist of the line of questioning by Representative Easley during that first hearing. So I think that a lot of the things that you said are correct, and I think that we're all sticking to our job, and there are some things that are sort of spilled milk. We can speculate as to what the Human Services Secretary could have done differently. Unfortunately, once she set her path forward, we're all sort of we all have to deal with that. I do not believe that we should give Optum a free pass. I mean, I think I agree with you there that if we look at what has transpired here, that everything has to be on the table.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and like I said, I've been in, this is now the fourth hearing on this issue to try to determine, how we got to where we are, what was the process. And for me, it's, what are the lessons learned and how can we make sure that, we do a better job in the future to make sure we don't get to this point. That, we've got the checks and balances in place, the information comes to light, and everybody feels like the due process has been followed with regard to their opportunity to address questions that might come up. And, I appreciate y'all coming forward, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that at some point, Optum's at the table to talk about their role in this whole process with regard to, what their contract is with the state of New Mexico, what the checks and balances they had in place, how their policies and procedures may have changed to get us to this point, and could something have been done different to make sure that we didn't have so many providers impacted in the way that we were. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.